seconds to go. We need a Minneapolis miracle. Case on a deep drop, steps up in the pocket. He'll fire to the right side. Off by Diggs. Stay up. Oh my God! 30, 10, touchdown! Are you kidding me? Miracle finish! It's a Minneapolis miracle! Oh my God! No way! Ah! What a miracle finish!
And welcome into the State of Purple. My name is Aj Mansour. That's Jack Day. We are your hosts for the State of Purple podcast. Week 10 edition. Minnesota Vikings getting set to board a plane tomorrow afternoon and head to Los Angeles to face off with the Los Angeles Chargers. Justin Herbert. Jack, this was one of those games when we previewed the schedule at the beginning of the year, and we saw a bunch of teams that we don't normally see and a bunch of new, young, up-and-coming stars in the NFL with Justin Herbert leading the way for those San Diego Chargers.
Yeah, this was one that I think you and I both kind of had circled on the calendar prior to the Vikings getting off to their 3-5 start. The reasons you just said, and on top of it, I think if this were to be a more competitive game, and it could be a very competitive game, but if the Vikings were also 5-3 traveling out to LA, I think it would make things a lot more interesting. I know back in whether that was July, August, September, at some point throughout the season, I think it was training camp at some point, maybe into the preseason, Chargers fans and Vikings fans are getting into it a little bit on Twitter, saying, I think it stems a little bit from the Justin Herbert winning the offensive rookie of the year award, whatever it was, over Justin Jefferson. Then there's some beef between Justin Jefferson. The Chargers Twitter account got involved with the Justin Jefferson beef between Keenan Allen. All of those storylines, I think, would have followed into this game. But now that the Vikings are what they are, sitting at 3-5, unlikely to be a playoff team, it kind of takes a little bit of the fun out of that.
It's amazing how much that changes things, right? Just a couple games out. But as we look at it, the Minnesota Vikings realistically are one game out of the playoffs. I know that's silver lining on making a shiny turd or whatever the saying is, but that is the reality, right? So the season's not over. It feels like it is. For most fans, it feels like Mike Zimmer is, a dead man walking and going to be replaced at the end of the year. It feels like this team has a lot that they still need to figure out. That being said, Jack, every time we analyze these games, every time we talk about what the Vikings did or didn't do, the flashes in the pan that they showed, the things that they came up short with, we continue to talk about how we think this team is talented. They're just not putting it together. If they start to put it together and they have some division games against teams like the Bears and the Lions coming up, you have some opportunities to get winnable games against teams like San Francisco, maybe, who isn't quite as good as we thought that they could be. They could make a run. They could make this thing interesting. Most likely, though, they'll end up right in the middle like the Minnesota Vikings always do.
Yeah, I've had this conversation a couple times already this week. I'm not going to be shocked if the Vikings somehow win the next 4, 5, 6, 7 games, go on some sort of streak. I also won't be shocked if the Vikings lose out and they finish with 3 wins. It's just, that's how this season feels. It's extremely unpredictable. The only thing that you can predict feels like it shouldn't be predictable because of how close these games actually have been. It feels like the Vikings are right there, and then they've just let these last few slip away. So I don't know. I think this is going to be another close game. I think I said the Vikings were going to lose by 10 or 11 points in my other podcast. After doing a little bit more research, I don't think the Chargers are going to win big, but the optimism that I have left, or whatever was left inside of me, I think that's completely gone. We're starting to see something that we'll get into a little bit more at the back end of the show, but Rick Spielman is starting to, and granted it was a Thursday night game between two top 5, top 6 quarterbacks, which you don't get on Thursday nights too frequently. He was out there watching 2 2022 draft eligible prospects at the quarterback position. So it's a weird year. I really think anything can happen. Like I said, the Vikings could end up winning this game, bring the fans back in and kind of go your route and say, hey, they're going to kind of hover around that 500 for the rest of the season, whether they squeak into that 7th seed or not. I will say, I don't know if I think the Bears are starting to look a little bit better. Justin Fields is starting to play a little bit better. If the Vikings get to that point in the season and the season's already lost and they get beat twice by Justin Fields, I think that even makes this season the taste of this season even a little bit more sour.
Well, when you talk about the divisional shifts and the things that can happen within the division, those carry over season to season, right? So if you lose those games to Justin Fields, we think that the Bears are bad. But if they prove that they are maybe still bad and still beat us, and Justin Fields shows some promise, that's salt in the wound for Minnesota Vikings fans that wanted to move up to get Justin Fields. You have that report of the Vikings trying to do so and not being able to, or not being willing to take the price to trade up and get him like the Bears did. But you have that opportunity to set the table for next year and carry in and elongate this disappointing season. So it's a long ways coming, and there's still a lot of time between here and there. It is week 10 though, Jack. We talked on Tuesday about our feelings for the Minnesota Vikings. We talked all season about our feelings for the Minnesota Vikings and what they struggle to do, where their deficiencies are, what they need to do to continue to be a successful team or to shift into being a successful team. So today, let's talk about I almost said San Diego. Let's talk about the Los Angeles Chargers. We mentioned Justin Herbert. We know Austin Eckler. We know Mike Williams can be a dynamic threat. We know Keenan Allen still exists. There are some offensive weapons that are dangerous, I guess. Do you sense that this is going to be a high-scoring game, or is this going to be one of those games where you have the pieces for the offenses to be high-flying and put up a bunch of statistics, but it isn't just going to come to fruition either because they're not good enough, they're not consistent enough, or the defenses can step up and do something?
Yeah, I do think it's going to be high scoring, and at the very least, I don't know if the Vikings are going to win. I think it's going to be an entertaining football game. I was kind of looking at some of the offensive and defensive stats for both teams, and what jumped out to me was these two teams offensively, strictly looking at stats, not going into the analytics and all that stuff for the people that are a lot smarter than I am. I think they were within 0.2 yards of total offense of what they were averaging per game, which is crazy. And the only difference was the Vikings are averaging 22 more yards on the ground, and the Chargers are averaging 22 more yards through the air, which I think is fair to expect that. Justin Herbert at one point in the season was kind of having the MVP or getting his name thrown into the MVP conversation. You mentioned Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Austin Eckler. There's a ton of firepower on that offense. One other positional battle it's not even a positional battle. It's two guys that play the same position that I think will be a storyline in this game. Rashaan Slater is who the Chargers drafted, their left tackle. I've seen him all over PFF saying how many pressures he's allowed, 0 sacks and 50, 100 snaps. Rashaan Slater went right in front of the Vikings. I think he was a player that they had their eyes on, and then they traded back. And now Vikings fans are starting to get to see their own first-round draft pick and Christian Darrisaw kind of come into his own at the NFL level. So I think that's going to be another storyline worth monitoring. The thing that scares me the most in this game is the Vikings are still dealing with COVID issues, injury concerns. The injury report came out literally like a half hour ago, I think. And I think Anthony Barr, Michael Pierce were both ruled out. Obviously, there's still no Patrick Peterson, no Danielle Hunter. Garrett Bradbury is still on the COVID list, and then Harrison Smith is still on the COVID list. I think that rounds them all out. But that's a lot of your guys, not only your guys, but that's a lot of starters on that defense that aren't going to play. We're going to get to see, and Kenny Willeks was also another addition to that list, which was a guy that we saw some promise in last weekend. Yeah. So the defense, I don't think this is going to be a very defensive game on either side, especially with the Vikings. I'm excited to see if Cameron Bynum can kind of build off what he did in Baltimore and kind of start to show that he belongs in the NFL. He can start as a safety for this football team moving forward. I don't think that's going to happen when Harrison Smith comes back. It's still Harrison Smith. Xavier Woods has been playing phenomenal football too. So it's going to be fun. We'll get to see Mason Cole again at center, seeing some of these guys that we didn't anticipate we were going to get to see. And that just kind of stems from the conversation you and I have had about if this team does start to struggle and the record's out the window, let's start to see some of these young guys. Chaz Surratt is another guy that I would hope he's going to address now with Anthony Barr not playing. We haven't seen much out of him. He was a third-round pick, I believe, third or fourth, and I'm almost positive it was third-round pick. Linebacker out of North Carolina, the quarterback switch linebacker. Like to see him a little bit more. Like to see some Patrick Jones now that Willekes isn't playing. There's a lot of guys when a season is lost that I think you can get some optimism built up for going into the 2022 season, into that draft class. I think we'll see some of those guys against the Chargers, especially Bynum, and like down the road, I'd like to start seeing more and more of them if, like I said, the season is indeed lost.
Jack, one interesting situation, forgive me, I didn't have this on our run sheet before, but that I noticed last week with one of those players that we were all looking forward to seeing. An opportunity came up for him to come into the game. Oli Udoh went out with an injury, and we just assumed, looking at the depth chart, the official depth chart, we assumed based off what we saw in the preseason and what we had hoped for with the draft pick, that Wyatt Davis would be the one that would come in and fill in at that right guard position. In the middle of the game last week, though, it was Blake Brandel who came in and filled in. He's a backup right tackle, but he came in at the right guard spot. How do you read into that? What do you think is going on with the Wyatt Davis thing? This was a spot that we thought, Oli Udoh has struggled, right? He hasn't like been a rock star up there. He's had a lot of penalties. He's had some misplays and missteps along the way. So it's not as if there's an all-pro right guard ahead of him. But now that the opportunity was open and the door was open, we still didn't see Wyatt Davis. Any idea or what do you think about that situation there? Is it just a kid who's not ready to take the field?
I think that has something to do with it. I think there's some people that are frustrated, and I think that is fair to an extent, because going into the draft, Wyatt Davis, I guess not going into the draft, but throughout the 2020 season, before Wyatt Davis kind of started battling with some injuries at Ohio State, he was looked at as a first-round pick, and he slid to the Vikings. I think they got him with the 90th overall pick, if I'm remembering correctly, and throughout training camp, I had checked in on him a couple times, and it was like, yeah, he doesn't seem ready. I don't know if he wasn't picking up the playbook fast enough or if he was just making mental mistakes throughout practice, but it seems so odd because Oli Udoh was also another tackle. Ezra Cleveland, the left guard, was a left tackle in college. Now they're bringing in – it just seems like they want to build up this offensive line with all tackles, which I don't think we've seen that be an issue with the interior kind of being undersized. You don't really have those true – meaty guys that Eric Hendricks talks about on the defensive side of the ball. They don't really have that. Oli Udoh is that. He's a little bit bigger and he fits that guard profile a little bit better, but he has struggled with the penalties. So yeah, I think that's definitely worth some some frustration, because I think there was a lot of hope around Wyatt Davis heading into the season, and so far he's essentially been a ghost for this team.
One new thing has popped up for the Minnesota Vikings this week. We talked about the struggles they had on offense last week, the struggles that they had to put a consistent game plan together in the middle of the game, whatever. One thing that wasn't part of the game last week, at least publicly speaking, has popped up as a potential distraction for this team and for specifically Dalvin Cook. There's some allegations of domestic abuse off the field that are popping up with an ex-girlfriend. There's a he said, she said civil suit going on right now. That all came to light about Tuesday or Wednesday this week. Some videos were released, some pictures were released. It doesn't look like a great situation, and we don't need to speak either way towards what we think is happening there, because there's no way to really know. Outside of that, though, this is a distraction, right? We've talked a couple times before how this season and the strangeness surrounding it, the weird things, the COVID, the Kirk stuff, a bunch of different things, it kind of feels like the 2010 season when the dome collapsed and the Brett Favre off the field stuff happened, Percy Harvin stuff. I mean, this stuff is happening again, where there's just so much surrounding this team that is adding to the distraction factor that goes into this game. Do you get the sense that Dalvin is going to impact his game at all if this situation is now out in the open?
I don't know if it would necessarily impact his game. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I don't know if I can really fully speculate on that, but it's certainly a distraction for that locker room. I think you said it best. I mean, going back to 2010 and the Metrodome collapsing, all of that stuff, you can bump that up a couple of years. When Mike Zimmer came to Minnesota in 2014, the amount of stuff, I will give him credit where credit is due, the amount of stuff that Mike Zimmer has had to deal with as a head coach of this football team, and I know this goes into that title. I mean, a lot of coaches around the NFL have to deal with weird situations, but Mike Zimmer, every single year, it seems like something just really odd happens or some like catastrophic injury. There was the Adrian Peterson stuff that happened. There was the Adrian Peterson got injured. That was another thing, the Teddy injury, Mike Zimmer and his eye stuff, and now COVID, and now some of this Dalvin stuff. It's been a bumpy roller coaster ride for the last 7-8 years of his tenure here. And I have a lot of respect for Mike Zimmer. I think he's done a good job at coaching this team. I know we've kind of gone back and forth on that and shared some opinions on if we think he should be gone, should he stay. I do have respect for the man. We don't need to get into that. If you want to get into that, you can listen to Monday's show or Tuesday's show, whenever that was recorded and put out. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think it is a distraction. This is something that these guys, it's going to be in the back of these guys' minds. And like you said, I don't want to speak too much on it because it really is a lot of he said, she said. There's not a lot of actually true factual evidence for this quite yet. I'm sure that will start to kind of unwind down the road. But until then, I don't really want to speculate too much on it because I don't have a great understanding of who's lying, or I shouldn't even say lying, but who's factual and unfactual.
Right. And we don't need to get into that at all. It will be some factor the rest of the season because it's not going to go away, right? This isn't going to be we're going to figure it out this weekend and it'll be gone. So it'll be part of the narrative the rest of the way here, Jack. Let's get some predictions real quick before we get off to our closing statements and your thoughts about Rick Spielman scouting more quarterbacks. An interesting thing. You mentioned that earlier. What are you feeling, though? Is that you mentioned that you think this might be a high-scoring game. Is this going to be the kind of game flow that we've seen with the Minnesota Vikings where they score first and they fall asleep and then they come back? I mean, the same old with this team?
Yeah, I think the Vikings, as much as I don't want to say this and make a joke about it, maybe they come out and they score on their first series and the offense disappears, force a couple turnovers from Justin Herbert. No, I'm kind of kidding. But I do think it's going to be a high-scoring game. I don't think the Vikings are going to win. This just comes down to two teams and who wants it more, in my opinion. I think the Chargers are going to want this more. I think the Vikings in that locker room, as hard as this is to say, I think sitting at 3-5, the expectations they had going into the season, they were not expecting to be 3-5. Right. I just get the sense that they're kind of down for the count already. And maybe that if they string a couple games together and they pull my heartstrings back into things, I'll change my mind. But right now it just feels like they're kind of they're down, out for the count. Kirk Cousins, I brought this up as well. Kirk Cousins kind of playing good and then not playing good and playing consistent. He's been playing fine, but we talked about this in our last show as well, like the fearless thing. It doesn't seem like he's played with that edge that we saw a few weeks ago where he was shaking Mike Zimmer. We haven't seen that side of Kirk Cousins, and this team needs that side of Kirk Cousins if they want to build off of something, because the defense, with all the injuries, with the COVID stuff, I don't think the defense is going to be able to keep them in this game like they were able to do in Baltimore, which means the Vikings offense is going to have to score points. And after the first series of the last few games, they just haven't been able to do that. So I don't think the Vikings win this one. I think it's going to be something along the lines of the Chargers putting up 34, 35 points, and I'll give the Vikings like 28.
Who's that dude in the chat watching on YouTube says the Vikings win 64-3. I'm not so sure that'll be the case. I think Austin Eckler is on tap for a big game. He's the kind of back that can escape out of the backfield and get lost, and the Vikings struggle with those sorts of running backs. So I think you'll see a lot of dump downs, him involved in the passing game, him involved in the run game, a touchdown or two. I know a lot of fantasy football people are hoping for that as well. Excuse me, as he's been one of the top running backs for fantasy football this season. But I think that he poses problems for this team. You also have Mike Williams, who has been quiet for the last couple of weeks after a big start to the season, who could take the lid right off the top of this defense without Harrison Smith back there, with some injuries in the cornerbacks and defensive backs. You're going to see a lot of Mackenzie Alexander, and I don't know how we feel about that quite yet. Bashaud Breeland, we all know how we feel about that one. So I think the opportunities will be there for the Chargers. I see it being like a 30-20 game where the Vikings end up losing by probably double digits or close to that. That would be right at that 30-20 mark. Jack, before we head out of here, though, you did mention that Rick Spielman was scouting a couple quarterbacks on Thursday night. Tell us a little bit about that and what you read into his continued scouting of quarterbacks, despite the fact that Kirk Cousins is here, despite the fact that they just drafted Kellen Mond.
Well, it seems really weird to me. Like that's the only word I can use to explain this entire season, honestly, is the word weird. But it came out, I think last Monday, it came out that Rick Spielman over the weekend, a couple weeks ago, was down in Nevada scouting a big arm quarterback prospect in Carson Strong. This week, it was a Thursday night game, so I think that kind of helps with scouting, and it sure makes it a lot easier for these guys, scouts, GMs, to get out to the game. But North Carolina played Pittsburgh. Kenny Pickett, quarterback for Pittsburgh, took on Sam Howell. I think Sam Howell, they've kind of gone in opposite directions. Kenny Pickett wasn't necessarily going into the 2021 season. I don't think Pickett was a guy that a lot of teams had on their radar necessarily, where Sam Howell was up there with, I believe it was like Sam Howell right behind Spencer Rattler, who has fallen and lost his starting job for Oklahoma. But what I've seen with these quarterbacks, with the two quarterbacks he was scouting last night, it just feels, they both feel like they're the true competitor style of quarterbacks. Like, these guys hate losing. They're going to go out there and play with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. They both have accurate arms, have the strength to push the ball down the field. I wouldn't say either of them are Lamar Jackson or Kyler Murray mobile, but neither of them are similar to Kirk Cousins. If you want to draw that comparison, they're somewhere in between. They have the mobility to kind of avoid pressure. So it says something. It very well could be just Rick Spielman and this Vikings front office and their scouting staff doing their due diligence at this time of year. I don't know if they even know exactly what the team needs are going to be. I'm sure they have a good idea, but that'll start to come out more with the combine and then into the draft. But right now, seeing Rick Spielman in back-to-back weeks scouting two, probably I'll say top 5, top 6 quarterbacks in this draft class, I think that says something. And on top of it, you look at Kirk Cousins' cap hit in 2022, it's $45 million. Yeah. If this team is going in the direction of a rebuild, I just don't feel like you can rebuild with the quarterback making $45 million. You and I have both stuck up for Kirk Cousins when he's played well. He hasn't necessarily played awful this season, but I don't think he's necessarily played great either. And I think if you can get a young quarterback that's willing to push the ball down the field a little bit more, willing to take some chances, I think that can kind of spark this offense. And on top of it, it would just allow the front office to kind of build around that rookie quarterback, whereas Kirk Cousins is holding back $45 million that could be allocated elsewhere on this roster.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of moving parts until the season ends. We'll have to see where that goes. Jack, we're going to vacate this virtual stream room for Program Password, which is coming up next. If you're interested in that, check it out there. But yeah, we'll duck in Sunday after the game, give our first opinions on what's going on. And Minnesota Vikings headed out to Los Angeles to take on the Chargers, a late afternoon game. 3:15 kickoff, and then the rest of the way we'll be going. So this is the State of Purple podcast, KFAN's Minnesota Vikings podcast. You can find old episodes of this podcast on iHeartRadio, iTunes, or wherever your favorite podcasts are posted. And you can follow Jack on Twitter. He's Jack_H_day. Get all the Vikings breaking news and his opinions that he posts to KFAN.com until Sunday evening. We'll sign off. I'm Aj Mansour. That's Jack Day. This is the State of Purple podcast.
10 seconds to go. We need a Minneapolis miracle. Case on a deep drop. Steps up in the pocket. He'll fire to the right side.